Hi, Krista.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. On Meaning of Life TV, you are Krista Tippett, probably known to a lot of our viewers and listeners as the voice of On Being, your show that airs every week on PBS. I mean, on NPR. And you are also the author of this book that we're going to talk about today, Becoming Wise: An Inquiry into the Mystery and Art of Living, which has a pretty substantial connection to On Being, I would say,
Yes.
right?
hmm
Um, Draws considerably on the many interviews you've had over the years, but at the same time is not a mere compilation. I mean, you're doing synthesizing and reflection, and so it's kind of. I mean, is it kind of a grand summing up, or
Sorry, was it, what did you say?
is it kind of a grand summing up in a way?
Summing up? Well, it's a grand summing up as of 6 months ago when I stopped working on this book. And I've continued to have some amazing conversations, into this week. I'm not sure I'll ever. It's a very complicated thing to write, but I think it is, as you say, it's a reflection of. I've always felt like the conversations I have are in conversation with each other in my head, and the book was kind of an attempt to capture a slice of that, but also to bring in how I then make sense of it. Right. So as you said, it's not a collection of interviews. It was really hard to write. I'm glad I've done it. But yeah, I don't know. Grand summing up, I think would be. I think maybe because I was thinking I needed to do a grand summing up, it was hard to get to this point.
Oh, I see. Yeah, there's a danger in thinking of things in overly dramatic terms. Yes,
Yeah,
I know that feeling.
yeah.
Um, so why don't we? There is some autobiographical reflection, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to start with that part of it before we move on to the other parts. Um, you've had an interesting life. You grew up as a Southern Baptist. You had a grandfather who was a Southern Baptist minister. And you also went to divinity school, Yale Divinity School, after going to Brown. You were, I guess, a foreign correspondent for a while, a stringer for the New York Times in Europe, and also worked in the State Department.
Right.
And then wound up starting the radio show that was originally called Speaking of Faith.
hmm
Now, I'm curious why you changed the name of the show from Speaking of Faith to On Being.
The weekly show, Speaking of Faith, started in 2003. It was the original. It was the early post 9/11 years. It was a moment when we had an evangelical president in the White House. And it was a moment when that word faith and the notion of faith was being thrown about with lots of drama and encapsulated by, and being covered in media as encapsulated by a few really strident voices. And so I sometimes say, although I ultimately didn't think Speaking of Faith was at all a good representation of what happens in the show, I think at that moment in time, I felt like it was important to do something and to put that word faith in the title and say, yes, this is public radio. And yes, we are speaking of faith. And it can be something that we can discuss with intellectual content as well as spiritual content. It can, there's so many important subjects we talk about under that rubric. And I think, one of the most interesting things to me was immediately when we put the show on the air, people flooded into the space who weren't religious at all, lots of atheists and agnostics, but who actually have ethical lives and moral lives and want to be part of that conversation of all the things we talk about when we speak about faith. Ultimately, again, I think my interest is in the animating questions behind this part of life that we call religious and spiritual. Those are also humanistic questions. Um, I, I felt eventually that Speaking of Faith didn't describe what was going on because we're not talking about something, more out of something, or I'm interested in how scientists who are not at all religious are making discoveries and making observations which are spiritually evocative. So in order to create a container for that, I think On Being was a title that is more spacious and more hospitable, and intellectually hospitable as well, which has always been important to me.
Okay, so the show addresses questions and themes addressed by religions, but you didn't want to confine the answers to religious answers, I guess.
And already 7 years in, I was talking to lots of people who weren't in any traditional way religious.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Does the transition from between those two names have any parallel with a transition that went on in your own life and your own way of thinking about things? I mean, you were raised in a very traditionally religious environment.
I was, but then I, like a lot of people, went away to college and wasn't religious at all for a good decade. Didn't think about religion or imagine that it was relevant. And I was very political, and that's where I thought the interesting questions were. So I had kind of come back to taking this seriously. And the reason I went to seminary is to make sure that I could do this with intellectual integrity. And in fact, I found that theology is thrilling and so rich. And I felt like, it's a rigorous way of thinking that has great relevance to a lot of the kinds of complexity and challenges we face. So that was a discovery I made that kind of made me want to start the radio show. It's an interesting, the way you've asked the question is interesting. One way I talk about how the show has changed me is just in my appetite for mystery, my comfort level with what can't be pinned down, what I don't have any desire or need to pin down. So, in that sense, I guess, though I thought maybe in 2003 that we could, I felt like the word faith and a lot of discussion about religion shuts imaginations down. And what I wanted to do is create a conversation that would open imaginations up. I think I eventually realized that you cannot do that with the word faith front and center. It's not going to work for a lot of people. And I think I am probably personally also less, I think that word is one word we need, but it's not big enough. So in that sense, the evolution of the show probably did reflect my evolution as well.
Mm-hmm. Your emphasis on the word mystery is interesting because I think there's a kind of interesting contrast between that and wonder. One thing you hear often from people who are not religious when they talk about parts of their lives that bring them something of what religion brings them is wonder.
Yes.
So like contemplating looking out in the Milky Way and pondering the number of galaxies out there. But it's interesting that although the word wonder, it literally means you wonder like you don't know. In this context, it mainly refers to things we do know. Wonder at the number of galaxies, the wonder of things science has shown us. Whereas mystery refers to the things science hasn't figured out, may never figure out, and maybe are not amenable to scientific inquiry. And both mystery and wonder can evoke a kind of awe, but they're very different.
Yes, although I experience a lot of scientists to have a very robust vocabulary of mystery, to be really comfortable with that word. And it's something they take delight in. I think it's almost a scientific virtue to be excited by what you realize you don't understand. And even, I was just talking this week with Frank Wilczek, who's a physicist, a Nobel physicist, who talks a lot about beauty and mystery. I think even scientists don't necessarily have any need to attach a kind of transcendent meaning to this, but they are often using that word with a real grandeur, the mystery of the cosmos and how amazing it is that there's so much we don't know. And I think actually religious people and our culture at large could learn a lot. I think our religious culture could learn a lot from that orientation.
Okay. One other question before we get started on the book itself. That's a kind of maybe a common question these days, because there is this phrase out there that's been out there a while: spiritual but not religious. One reading of the change of names in your show might be, well, it's going to be spiritual but not necessarily religious. In any event, I'm sure you've thought about what kinds of things people mean by the word spiritual. So do you have your own interpretation, either of the phrase spiritual but not religious, or a sense of what people mean by it, which I think actually is a lot of different things depending on who you talk to, or your own definition of what spiritual means, or any of that?
I think spiritual is a tricky word, and I would have to say I think all of these words around this part of life are freighted differently for different people. And so the faith word is hard for some, and the spiritual word is hard for others. And I think if, personally across time, I've probably fallen more on the side of not using of being less comfortable using the word spiritual, just because it's so amorphous. One thing I say in the book is that I actually feel like that language of spiritual but not religious is the tip of an iceberg that has already moved on. In my conversations, especially in the last couple of years, I'm talking to a lot of people who will say they are religious but not spiritual, and some of them may be scientific, and they're talking about what we can know through our interaction with human beings. They're talking about understanding that ritual and even liturgy are and text and community, these things that religion has carried forward in time, are actually things that we need as human beings, but they don't necessarily need to attach a kind of transcendent spiritual meaning to that. And I also, I'm really fascinated about this phenomenon that is also kind of superficially called the nones, the NONES, that opinion poll driven description of a vast and growing swath of Americans, and especially young Americans. Again, that word nuns doesn't actually sum up that there is actually a lot of spiritual energy, by which I guess I mean, a curiosity about meaning and purpose, a search for internal moorings, a commitment to inner life, and for me, this is important. The spirituality that is interesting to me is always seeing the connection between inner life and our outer presence in the world. It's not of course it can be a purely private thing, but that's not so interesting to me as a conversationalist. So I think there's a lot of these nuns are disenchanted. A lot of them grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when religion had become this toxic force in American life and in American media. And they are absolutely allergic to religious excesses, religious stridency, and I think religious shallowness and hypocrisy. But there's an incredible amount of kind of ethical passion, and I would say even openly theological curiosity in this group. So to me, that richness that I just described, that canvas, which has a lot of diversity about it, is the successor, the place we're now in, actually beyond spiritual but not religious.
Okay, so when you say the spiritual can be about the connection between, I think you put it something like your inner life and your outer presence, or something like that, you mean the connection between your worldview, including the way you wrestle with the deep questions, and your actual conduct in the world, I presume, including in an ethical and a moral sense, in the way you treat other people.
How you treat other people, how you interact with the natural world, who you are, what imprint you make as you move through the world. And honestly, I think one reason a lot of young people are disenchanted with our traditions is that they have often been very articulate about belief systems and not modeled those things. There's this, I like to pose this thought experiment. If in the 1980s and 1990s in this country, when conservative religious voices, after a long silence, a long self-imposed silence, decided to become politically active again, what if the effect of that, the nature of that and the effect of that had been to model for us all what love of enemy looks like in public, how that could be a robust component in politics and geopolitics. That would be inner life that connects with outer life. I think if that had happened, the word faith would not be so freighted in the 21st century, and we wouldn't all be wringing our hands about faith in politics. And I think it is that kind of integrity that that new generations are insisting on.
That is an interesting thought experiment. That would have been a very different world than the one we had.
It would have led to all kinds. I mean, you can think about the ripple effects into the early 2000s.
So the book is called Becoming Wise. You distinguish in the book between being smart and being wise. What is the distinction?
Well, I certainly, I think intelligence is something that we speak a lot about, we study, we aspire to. I think we kind of know what we mean when we are talking about intelligence. I was having a conversation yesterday with someone who said, well, does this mean that you put intelligence to one side? And, absolutely not. I mean, for me, wisdom builds on intelligence, but wisdom is as much about discernment as it is about knowledge. It takes in not only what you know and how intelligent you are, but how you apply that. Again, how you live, as well as what goes on in your head, as the muscular sentences you can craft, but also what effect those muscular sentences have in the world around you.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it's implied in that is it partly involves the ability to kind of act in accordance with a sophisticated understanding of the world. Not just understand the world and be able to lay out the principles that govern the world, but actually act in accordance with what you've learned, which can be hard.
It's hard. And also it's not about being perfect. It's not about being saintly. And in fact, we tend to kind of romanticize words like sainthood and wisdom, but in fact, none of the saints were perfect. And so, I think that was one of the most important things for me to really think through when I was thinking through wisdom, when I was writing the book. And the truth is, there's no mystery about this. I don't think. We all know in our lives, we can summon a memory. If we start thinking about what wisdom is, we will see faces. We will have memories. We will know people who became wise. We'll know that it was hard won. We'll know that they were not perfect people, but that there was an integrity to their intention, and I think to their constant, to their perseverance in living according to that intention, even though it wouldn't always. That they wouldn't always live up to it, because that's the human condition.
Are there specific people who spring to mind when you think wise person?
Oh gosh. Well, I suppose that's one of the great gifts of doing this work I do, because I think I talk to wise people all the time, and I think there are a lot of uncelebrated wise people. One thing I have insisted on not doing is not just interviewing celebrities. Or there are famous wise people. I've sat with Desmond Tutu.
That's who I was actually thinking of when I asked the question, because I know he is among them, many people you've interviewed.
Among them, and Jean Vanier is among them, and Thich Nhat Hanh, and the Dalai Lama, and Wangari Maathai. But I also think of this woman who I'm going to have dinner with tonight here in St. Paul, who's in her 80s. And here's the thing: we also all know. Everybody doesn't grow wise. Some people just get old. Yeah. It's something we have to walk in.
Cranky is the alternative to becoming wise in old age.
Alternative. So it's not necessarily a given of age. But I am thinking of someone I'm going to see tonight who has lived her 80 plus years with this searching and joy, and has learned and has continued to, take life by the horns, and who I want to be like when I'm that age. So, I mean, I think wisdom comes in many shapes and sizes.
Okay, so much of the book is divided into 5 sections that are called respectively words, flesh, faith, love, and hope. Now, I'd like to go through all of them if we have time. Let's start with words. It never would have occurred to me if I was writing a book to have a section, even if it was about wisdom, to have a section on words, because I would have thought, well, the whole book is words. That's the medium of expression. I mean, it's like so tell me how that idea came to you and what you're up to there.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that I had an early editor who said, when looking at an outline, said, I think you can just do away with this chapter. It's self-explanatory, kind of like you're saying. But I mean, I deal in words, right? That's my medium. And I am aware of how powerful words are, of how powerful questions are. And I actually think in American culture in particular, I don't think we have quite a proper reverence before that power of our words. And even the fact that, Marie Howe, the poet, is somebody who's in the book. And one thing she said to me, she said, of course, there are at any given moment people living in, crisis situations, survival situations. But she said, for many of us, words are a large part of our action in the world. To the extent that we are moving through the world affecting other people, it's through the words we speak. That's one way I'd answer the question. I do interview a lot of poets, and that's something I didn't know I would do when I started the show all those years ago. Like, I didn't know I'd talk to so many physicists. I actually think that poetry is something that human beings need, almost like they need water and air. We don't know it, though. We can forget this. There's something about beautiful words and ennobling words. And I just was interviewing a poet, David White, last week. What did he say? He said, poetry is language against which we can't defend ourselves. Language that is crafted in such a way that we have to take it in, that we have to wake up a little bit to take it in. And
that's interesting, because I think of poetry as something that often takes more work to take in a certain sense, right? You kind of have to puzzle over things sometimes with a certain type of poetry, and sometimes you feel you haven't solved the puzzle. So it's I guess whatever he said, hard to defend against, or that you can't defend against, in the sense that it's not like an argument, so you can't refute it. You can't say, I dismiss the argument being presented in this poem.
yeah.
But it is, and I speak as someone who I have been accused of more than one daughter of being not sufficiently sensitive to poetry. But so I'm curious, you've already gotten at this a little, but what poetry can do for the reader that prose can't do for the reader, in your view?
And I don't even think it's for the reader. I mean, I guess I'm using poetry. So I'm using poetry as perhaps the clearest contrast to the careless, combative way we use words in this culture, right? Because as you say, the reason any words that kind of stop us in our tracks and we can't defend ourselves, the reason that's good for us is because the mode we're in so much of the time is in, wielding our opinions, like wearing them on our sleeves, and we know precisely how to, you express your opinion, and I know how to come back with mine. And there are so many other ways we need to communicate and learn from each other. I also believe that, questions, we basically deal in competing certainties culturally. And we when we're debating an issue, we set up the two certainties that form the poles, and you take a side. And in fact, any issue that has to do with human life, certainly our common life, has so much nuance in between those two poles, but we don't know how to dwell there. And to take an observation from the religious realm, the great theologian of the prophets, Walter Brueggemann, pointed out to me that it's not just that the prophets are champions of social justice, that they also always employ poetic language that, again, kind of unsettles and puts us off our usual stride so that actually maybe something can come in. And he said, you know, if there's one line of Martin Luther King's rhetoric that we all remember, it is, "I have a dream." And that is as much a line of poetry as it is a line of political rhetoric. So I think when you start looking for this, you see it everywhere. And I don't know, I think it's absolutely critical to our souls that we figure out how to use that power of words among ourselves generatively and creatively. And, there's such a need. When I look at this current political climate, there's so much to be dismayed about. But what I see behind a lot of the most hateful gatherings, the gatherings at which there are hateful expressions,
we won't mention any names here.
Well, there's Trump.
Yeah.
I don't even feel like that's about taking a political stance. It's a cultural phenomenon. But what I know is there's a huge, vast well of human pain and fear and uncertainty that is making people literally crazy, because human beings are made crazy by uncertainty. They're much. We know how to deal with a fight, but give us uncertainty over the economy or or children's education or where it's all going, we go crazy. Some of us go crazy. So there's a huge need in this culture, beyond this political season, for people who are just about calming fear, which does not sound like a very glamorous role. But I think there's so many important conversations we can't have, so many important decisions we can't make, so many important structures we can't change without getting some of that pain and fear out of our public room. So that's how I start to think about how words are really significant to talk about and to work on.
Okay. So the second of these kind of main sections, these chapters, is flesh. Another title that has never adorned a chapter of mine. What were you? How did that happen?
Well, I went back and forth. Is it the flesh? Is it the body? I ended up calling the chapter, or the subtitle, is "The Body's Grace," which was a phrase that came from an interview that is really important to me. And so flesh, the body's grace, but the physicality of us. And again, I think this is something, although we talk about our bodies all the time and obsess about them and analyze them and medicalize them, I think we are learning such amazing things about our brains and our bodies that help us connect ourselves, that help us not just know ourselves in our fullness, but be at home in ourselves. And I have a critique here with religion in particular. I mean, the religiosity I grew up with, while it was full of talk about what was sinful, and what was sinful usually had something to do with sex. And if it didn't have to do with sex, it had something else to do with the body, drinking or dancing or... But in fact, it was very disconnected. It was very chin up. What it really wanted to do was banish the body. It saw the body. My grandfather saw the body as an entry point of danger. That's pretty much where it ended.
Yeah, I grew up Southern Baptist too, by the way. So
Yes,
I share your pain.
What I see is that we did this disconnecting in so many disciplines. We did it in medicine in this bizarre way, right? We took the mind. We didn't understand the mind the way we do now. We didn't understand the way the brain and the body are communicating in unfathomable ways constantly. We not only divided the brain and the mind and the body. But we also divided the body up into parts as though they weren't speaking to each other. And I think the Enlightenment played its part in this too. This Enlightenment soundbite, I think, therefore I am. Well, thinking is a part of what we do. But if our thinking, this gets back to where we started, if our thinking is disconnected and out of sync with how we're living, with our physical presence, we're not all we should be. And And this is something that I never guessed. I mean, this is something I learned, through my life of conversation and also in my own life. Has been a big piece of my evolution, that kind of getting into my body, for me, it's been come through doing yoga, but it's not just about getting into my body, it's about getting out of my head, and connecting those things. And I really have come to some ideas that I can't even quite explain myself. I don't think we have as much access to mystery if we're not planted in our bodies. I think somehow our physicality is also essential if we're going to know something called transcendence, whatever that is. If it's transcendence through human relationship or some perception of mystery that we can't tie up. And I talk a lot about virtue in the book. And these are just, I kind of say virtues are spiritual technologies. I mean, these are things that neuroscience is actually helping us understand better practices. And the virtues all again, growing up, I would have said the body is about sin. It's about those transgressions. But virtue is not possible without the body either. And those are positive, generative ways we interact with others.
Yeah, and there's also speaking of mysteries and the body's connection to mystery, there's the mystery of the connection between your consciousness and your body, and I think that can be kind of accentuated by actually reflecting on the body, or almost clarified. I don't know.
Yes.
But not so clear that we understand it.
No, it's a huge frontier.
Yeah. So then there's a chapter called Faith. And this is in a way a natural transition from your discussion of flesh and your religious upbringing, because you say in this chapter that your earliest memory of faith connects it to fear. Mm-hmm. Elaborate on that a little.
Yes. Well, fear. I say, it connects. Fear was there, not fear alone, but yes, fear was in it. It was fear of sinning. It was fear of your body and the ways it would lead you astray. It was fear of these supernatural evil forces which would lead you astray, and it was ultimately fear of falling short and going to hell, basically. I mean, it was scary. The world was a treacherous place.
Yeah, I've noticed a tendency in myself. I guess I'd always noticed it, but I've only recently started thinking it's actually a legacy of my Southern Baptist upbringing, which is when something goes badly, doesn't work out the way I wanted it to, my first thought is, okay, what did I do wrong to cause this? And usually there is a causal connection. I mean, in principle, at least. It's in other words, what did you do wrong that could have led to this happening? But early on, of course, in life, there's the sense that you might have done something totally unrelated to the bad outcome if you're brought up in a certain religious way. You might have done something totally unrelated causally to the outcome, and yet it is the reason the bad outcome happened, right?
Yeah.
And I'm only starting to appreciate how deeply that may have affected me. So there must be a more... We have not exhausted the subject of faith, right? Faith has benign manifestations as well.
Yeah. Yes. You mean it even has good manifestations?
Right. It
even has positive, life-giving manifestations. Yeah. I mean, I contrast that. That fearfulness was about moral failing. It was always this danger that was just ever present, and you always had to be vigilant. And it, now I'm more interested in this idea of moral imagination. Again, like how we move through the world, and this kind of adventure, really, of the inner life we cultivate, and how we manifest that, and continue to cultivate it as we go through life. And that is just the orientation of that is expectant rather than terrified. Not at all overconfident that nothing will go wrong, or that I will fall short. But that there is this great adventure of creating your life, and also evolving your life of faith. And I think, faith, I say this, I think faith is evolutionary in any life, even in my grandfather's life. When it's not, that's when actually there's when it stops being living, I think, when it becomes something that is ossified.
Okay. And this term moral imagination, can you elaborate on that a little? Because that's used in different ways. I've used it to mean kind of putting yourself in the shoes of people when that's really hard to do because they're like an enemy or they're like very different culturally. But you're using it in a, I've noticed it's used in a lot of different ways. You're using it more broadly, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm using it as a way to talk about refusing to narrow any moral deliberation to a kind of idea that there's this way to do it or that way, that there's right and wrong, good and bad, that these things are clear cut and you choose one way. What I see in any complicated challenge in a life or in a society is just a vast amount of complexity and paradox. I was just, I think I mentioned this usually. So people sometimes ask me who's my favorite person I ever interviewed, and I say it's the last person I interviewed so today I'm thinking about Frank Wilczek, this physicist. And he has this beautiful idea that is so resonant with this idea of moral imagination that, and he's drawing it from physics, but it's true of the rest of life too, that the nature of any deep, deep truth is that the opposite of that deep truth is also true. So on the one hand, we are, as human beings, we are actually not what we think we are. We are, light and air and matter. And we are somehow following rules of the universe, which we can hardly comprehend. That is true. And it's also true, as he said, that we have this experience of being thinking beings who make choices and make decisions and who matter on some level. It's hard to make the case for both of those things at the same time. It's just like whether light is a particle or a wave. You can't actually make the case at the very same time that light is a particle and a wave, but both are true, depending on the questions you're asking. And I think moral imagination is unafraid of the complexity and paradox of human existence. But I think only if we are willing to engage life there, can we really be engaging its fullness and most importantly, really being able to get an imagination about what the possibilities for change are and the possibilities for moving beyond whatever, that we can't see at the moment, beyond whatever the quagmire or the quandary of the moment is.
Okay, so one thing your conception of moral imagination seems to have in common with the way I was using the term is it can lead it can make you be less quick to pass judgment on people.
Absolutely.
And that's an important part of the bottom line, I take it.
It will slow you down. And in fact, things that are important take time. This is a deep truth. It's very hard for Americans to internalize. But yes, moral imagination will make things less easy. But it requires some patience, which is actually realism. But it will lead places that cannot be seen if you're just thinking and acting in the simplistic categories of the moment. Cannot be observed, cannot be contemplated.
Okay. So the fourth of these 5 chapters is love. There's a lot to say about love. Is there something that you? I mean, I hate to ask you, to give me the bottom line on love. Sounds a little simplistic, perhaps. But what kinds of things?
I'll do it.
What are some things you've taken away from the many conversations you've had over the years on this subject with your guests?
Yeah. Well, what my desire in speaking the word love in the context of wisdom and wisdom that is also about common life is to propose that it's time for us that we need to grow up enough to figure out what love can mean in public as something that is unromantic, practical, robust. And of course, it's a word that is very ruined. I mean, it's overused. It's mostly used in very superficial, romantic, erotic contexts. But the fact remains that that people who have changed the world across time, who have changed the world and changed societies, and King is a good example, used the word love boldly. Their vision was not just about reforming structures or passing laws. The vision, got to that. And that vision of creating the beloved community that fired the civil rights movement, laws were passed. Some structures were changed, but the transition we have yet to make, the unfinished work that we still have 50 years later, is, and I would, it doesn't sound like a very legitimate thing to say in public, but can we love each other? Can we figure out what it means that we belong to each other and that we care about each other? And again, if love is unromantic, if we're talking about the agape of the Greeks, practical love, I mean, that is what we need to implement in our cities and our neighborhoods, and how we deal with our prisons and how we deal with people after they get out of prison. So it's important to me to note that in fact, we have started to hold the question of hate in our public life. Like we have created a new legal category because we have acknowledged the reality of hate, of something that, this place where tolerance runs its course, where the worst of human capacity rushes in.
You mean hate speech, the legal category we've created?
Hate crimes, right?
Hate crimes, yeah.
We have acknowledged that there are these places that human beings go that cannot be regulated by laws. And I think we need to acknowledge that there are also places that human beings go that go beyond laws and structures, but can actually create the community, the relationship one to another, that can actually yield the imagination to create the structures we need. And but again, with the structures, just with the laws, it doesn't get us there. We have to work on our relationship to each other and our imagination about each other.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a very hard thing to do, first of all, to love someone who isn't like your offspring or something in a meaningful way. It's particularly hard to do to follow the biblical injunction to love your enemy. And to get back to the whole issue of spiritual but not religious, the growth in the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, who have no religious affiliation, and the demise of not Christianity broadly speaking, but certain denominations are having trouble sustaining their energy, the mainline churches and so on. It seems to me that, I remember the message being preached from the pulpit, love, and it has a kind of power then, because the person telling you about it is kind of speaking for a God you believe in, mm-hmm. and has, and that brings a kind of authority to it, and there's a virtue in that. I often say to people who think that religion is unrelievedly a bad thing that, when I was in Texas as a kid, right after the Civil Rights Act was passed, I was singing the song, Jesus Loves the Little Children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white.
Yeah.
And, that had a kind of power by virtue of my religious belief. And I guess the question I'm very circuitously winding around to is like, assuming you're facing an audience that's, consists of the growing number of people who don't have old-fashioned religious belief and don't respond to religious authority, what are the ways you convey such a challenging message with power?
But see, I just don't. You're right. I also grew up with that love language, although I think a lot of it was empty, and a lot of it was so much about God that it wasn't that relevant to our daily lives. And I don't actually think we were equipped with any tools to live out love of neighbor, except for maybe our next door neighbor, which we didn't do because we heard it in church, or love of enemy. So, I'm kind of, I'm not offering, my prescription is not that I know how to do this, but that I think we have to start thinking about this and working with it. I also don't think that you or I need to be going to church right now, or even need to be believing in God to know that love has power in human life. I mean, we've all experienced this in private circles, and sometimes we see it in public, and it's so stunning when we see it in public, like after the shootings in Charleston, right? That very day, this church that had, and it was a church, these people who had welcomed this young man into their Wednesday night Bible study, and that very day expressed their love for him, even as they mourned the people they'd lost. And we all watch that and we say, that is the extraordinary best of what human beings are capable of. So I think we should aspire to that. Yeah. But that aspiration is not abstract. I think we have to get really granular about, again, what love would look like if it's muscular and practical and unromantic. And just, to come back to something you said a minute ago, sometimes, also we know this from life, sometimes love means stepping back, right? Loving your enemies can mean that you say nothing to them because you can't say anything nice. So I think we bring in all the complexity that, in fact, we have in our arsenal of experience. And we start to ponder what that looks like. And I think we need it because this is so hard, but also because it gets at the core of like who we are and the relational nature of who we are. We need each other. We're going to have to do this together. We have to do this as a common life thing, and we have to hold each other accountable. And there will be times when some of us step in to be loving, and some of us are not going to feel safe enough or are going to be too angry for perfectly moral reasons to step in and be loving. So it can't be that it rests with one of us.
Or we may fear the reaction we'll get if we start talking like that about someone who's supposed to be an enemy. So the final chapter is hope, I think. Maybe it's the final of these 5, certainly. Before we get to that, one thing I learned from the book that I didn't realize is that you are a Teilhard de Chardin fan. And I think talking about that a little leads naturally into the subject of hope. So why don't you, for people who don't know who Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, this mystical Catholic priest, theologian, paleontologist was, why don't you say a little about him?
So Teilhard de Chardin was working at the beginning of the last century, about 100 years ago. He very famously helped excavate the Peking man fossil in China, and was there for several other discoveries. He was a paleontologist. He was a Jesuit and a paleontologist, and that call of the Jesuits to find God in all things had taken him to paleontology, and he was there as we humanity were verifying the fact of our physical evolution, and of our physical evolution over vast, unimaginably long periods of time. And as he is seeing this, delighting in this discovery, he has this vision that these fossils of ancient humans are what our spiritual condition will appear, our kind of primitive spiritual condition will appear to the paleontologist or the theologian of the far future. He has this vision, which is very resonant with the internet, that the biosphere will be overlaid by what he called the noosphere, from the Greek word of mind and knowledge, so that our knowledge and our artifacts and our ability to connect would in fact overlay the biosphere and change it. And we now are said to be living in the Anthropocene, where in fact human invention and intelligence has geological force on the planet. So he looks very prescient, and so it was a hopeful, long vision, seeing that spiritually, in terms of our knowledge and our spirit, we are in our childhood, but that great advance, evolutionary advance, was possible. And that is the vision that I want to present for us to mull over and take some courage in, and perhaps take some aspiration from here in our early century, where the stakes are so high. I say in the book, I mean, we don't, our wars and economic crises are not anything like, not more harrowing than those things that were happening in the early 20th century, but that our ecological crisis, the vulnerability, the global vulnerability that's caused by our globalized economy, the stakes are existential for the challenges we face. And so we have to rise. I mean, this calls us to rise to our full powers, and those are physical and they are intellectual, and we need that wisdom to be able to really have a complex sense of our imagination about where to go, and a sense of how to begin and how to move forward.
Yeah, and he was, his surely almost technical discussions of technology seem so prescient. And, I mean, he was talking about a giant global brain.
Yes.
Not only way before the internet, before anybody was watching TV. He's writing like in the 30s and speaking very confidently about how the interconnections are only going to grow and humanity is going to be drawn into a single kind of consciousness. Now, he sounds to me more assured of a favorable outcome than I personally feel at the moment. And it isn't just because of environmental challenges. It's, just read the news. It's about, kind of tribalism, broadly speaking, sectarian, nationalistic, ideological disputes of a bitter and often violent nature that seem to feed on themselves. This brings us back to hope, which you've already mentioned, of course. But can you, before we say goodbye, do you want to reflect any more on hope in this context?
So I've had some conversations with evolutionary biologists and Andrew Rebkin, the kind of climate blogger, who also have looked at Teilhard and thought about now. And I find some solace in the idea that we are, in fact, in the adolescence of our species, and in fact that there are some, if you look at the planet, that picture you just described of tribalism, of war, of savagery, but alongside, inhabiting the same planet and sometimes the same city with incredible advance. It resembles what we know of the teenage brain, right? It is capable of incredible learning and creativity, and at the same time, incredible volatility and destruction and danger. And it's a good description of us as a species right now, because it's not one story. I mean, that story of danger is also the story that the news tells. In some ways, they're like my grandfather, only telling us about the peril. So yes, I agree that there are no promises that we get this right. But if we don't see these capacities we have, these hopeful capacities, this best of us that's possible, the better angels of our nature, and make some intentionality about living into that and seeing that when it's present in the world. And it is present in the world, all over the place. It's not necessarily on the front pages of the paper. I don't think we do have a chance if we don't take that seriously too, alongside all the things there are, realistically, to be pessimistic about. But that's not the whole story of us, and it doesn't have to be the ending of the story of us.
Yeah, no, the teenage brain analogy is hopeful because most teenagers turn out more or less okay. In the end, you sometimes have to wait a while. So the book is called Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living by Krista Tippett, whose radio show On Being is usually on Sunday mornings, probably in most places, right? That's where it is here. But also on the web. And in fact, you have an increasingly kind of expansive web presence. Your website includes more and more content that goes beyond the show. Yes. So people should check that out.
We have podcasts and apps and all those things.
Everything a person could want from the emerging global brain.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Krista. This was fun.
Thanks, Bob.
Take care.